reports of my demise are not exaggerated. That was the tweet from philosopher Hubert Dreyfus, which I read on April 22, 2017. It was obviously a play on Mark Twain's classic remark, the report of my death was an exaggeration. I, like others that day, at first thought the tweet a fake, a trolling, cringe-inducing web kind of joke that someone was playing on Bert, as he was called. But then, in an instant, I feared the jarring truth. Bert had in fact died, and the tweet was a sly joke that he was playing on us. He pulled off a beauty. How characteristic of the renowned philosopher and legendary teacher, reporting his own death on his own terms in his warm, quixotic style. A decade earlier, in the formative days of Closer to Truth, I'd spent a delightful day with Bert, asking him my favorite questions: consciousness, artificial intelligence, God, creation, religion, body and soul, existence, meaning of life. All from the perspective of phenomenology, the privileging of experience, what the world feels like to conscious beings, Bert's intellectual passion.
Let's just start.
I'm Robert Lawrence Kuhn, and in this special episode of Closer to Truth, we offer our tribute to Hubert Dreyfus. Hubert Dreyfus was a preeminent scholar of 20th century European philosophy and phenomenology, the study of conscious experience from a first-person point of view, especially the work of Martin Heidegger, also Michel Foucault, Maurice Merleau-Ponty, Soren Kierkegaard, and Edmund Husserl. Dreyfus's interpretation of human being, of Dasein in Heidegger's formulation, has had broad impact on the natural and social sciences and even beyond. His commentary on Heidegger's famously impenetrable time and being, called Being in the World, made Heidegger accessible to English-speaking readers. Bert, analytic philosophers would tend to dismiss phenomenology as something that's not relevant, that doesn't really help us to understand metaphysics.
Let's just start with what phenomenology sort of inherits and has to get out of, and which I think, and Heidegger would say, the analytic tradition is still stuck in. I was just teaching this yesterday, Heidegger teaching in 1925, railing against the idea that there's a problem of the external world, there's a problem of other minds, there's a problem of whether reality depends on us or is independent of us. He thinks they're all false problems, and he says you get an industry of philosophers constantly trying to solve them, getting jobs and refuting each other, but they starting from the wrong place. What's the wrong place? Well, the wrong place is Descartes. He is the villain. And what did Descartes do? He had the idea that we were self-sufficient subjects, and there's only two things in his ontology, two ways of being. You be a mind, self-contained, with ideas in it, and then there's on the other side the world. In Descartes' physics, it was bits of extended matter, the extended thing. Mm-hmm. And the question is how you get these two things together. They're both totally real, but there's a big problem about how this one, the thinking one, gets to know anything about the substance out there, which is self-sufficient stuff. Right. They go round and round before Heidegger comes along, and Heidegger just thinks the whole thing is wrong. How would you go about showing that this way of thinking that's dominated Western thinking totally, even the people who disagree with it in its terms somehow? Heidegger just going to trash it, break with it. So the first level, and the one that I like best, is Heidegger's notion of how we relate to the stuff in the world. And Heidegger says we deal with it. My word is cope with it. He says when you go out the door, you use the latch. That means you don't have to think about the latch, you don't have the goal of going out the door, you don't have to figure out that you use the latch. It's all in flow. Just act in flow. So at the basic level...
It's being in the world.
Yes, that's it. At the basic level, we are just dealing with things. And Heidegger calls that being in the world. That's the first move. Then there are about 5 different moves that Heidegger makes against the subject-object distinction. The next one is to say that we're the kind of being that has to take a stand on its own being. There are 3 kinds of being in Heidegger. There's the being that things have when we're using them as equipment. The doorknob's being is what Heidegger calls readiness to hand. There's the kind of being that objects have, which he calls presence at hand. And then there's a kind of being we have, which he calls Dasein, which is being there. And that kind of being has to take a stand on its being. They're really called to have an unconditional commitment and to understand who they are. But the only way they can understand who they are is by dealing with things. I need the, quote, external world to be me, but then it's no longer the external world. It's this whole organized bunch of objects with other people who are students and interviewers and so forth, and all of that in order to, again, get rid of the subject-object distinction. So finally, metaphysics gets switched around by a phenomenologist into a description of this ground level where the idea of inner and outer, subject and object doesn't even come up, and then you have being in the world and you can start out in a whole new direction. That's Heidegger. And what we learn isn't a bunch of facts that we store in our memory. What we learn is that the world looks richer and richer. For instance, Merleau-Ponty example now, a city looks strange and confusing and very meaningless at first, but once you live in it a while, what you know begins to show up in the city. The turn to the right looks like the way to the bakery, and the turn to the left looks like the way to the cleaners, and so forth. It just looks that way. You don't have to figure out how to get to the bakery. So we learn that that our way of being in the world is such that we don't have to store anything in our mind. The world is the best model of itself.
Being in the world, just dealing with things, coping. So simple, so profound. Hubert Dreyfus was born in 1929 in Terre Haute, Indiana, to Stanley Dreyfus, a businessman in the poultry industry, and Irene Lederer Dreyfus, a homemaker. Dreyfus studied philosophy at Harvard, arriving as a freshman in 1947. He received his BA with highest honors in 1951, completing an undergraduate thesis in the philosophy of physics under the famous philosopher W.V. Quine.
Bert, how do you approach consciousness from the standpoint of phenomenology?
To begin with, even the phenomenologists don't talk much about consciousness. It seems to me it's just a subject about which everybody agrees we know absolutely nothing. And everybody says, yes, it's the hard problem. And then they go on talking about what makes it so hard anyway. I think it's such a hard question that I don't understand why anybody wants to talk about it. I don't, but there is something I will talk about. One of the big deal things is consciousness gets so much tied in with self-consciousness, with being a subject, and a subject is conscious, a human subject. That means a subject has something inside it which is its stream of consciousness. And that's its inner story. And I think that that's the wrong thing to look for. I don't think that it's false that sometimes people have streams of experience and maybe they see after images, but it's certainly not our normal way. Basically, consciousness is not a matter of something inner. Phenomenologists think that's a very marginal breakdown sort of experiences. Mostly we're out there in the world having moods, acting, interacting with other people and so forth. That's what consciousness is, a world of attractions and repulsions. It's not inner stuff. Now,
but it feels like inner stuff.
Well, no, not when you're chasing the streetcar. It feels like I've got to get it. Getting closer, not even I've got to get it. That's wrong. Now, getting closer, pulling, and so forth.
When you're in the moment.
Yes, exactly. When you're absorbed in the moment, consciousness is gone. And self-consciousness is really gone. And most of the time we are absorbed in the moment. And therefore we're looking in the wrong place when we're looking at these inner feelings, which are these sort of breakdown moments when you're crying inside because you don't want other people to see it. So that's my only contribution, and it's not much. Because I think that's going to have the same, lots of its own.
Dreyfus was an early skeptic of the powers of artificial intelligence. His critique was not much appreciated by AI leadership. A paper he wrote for the RAND Corporation, the influential think tank, became Dreyfus's seminal 1972 book, What Computers Can't Do, a critique of artificial reason.
I think AI has failed, and it's failed in a way. It isn't even pointing in the direction of you're getting intelligent behavior, let alone consciousness. I taught at MIT for 8 years. The AI people were doing their artificial intelligence thing nearby, and they came into my class and said, well, if you philosophers have had 2,000 years and you can't understand consciousness, intelligence, language, learning, any of that, and we're beginning to understand it over here in the AI labs. And I thought, wow, if that's so, I better find out. Well, my brother happened to be hired at the RAND Corporation, so they hired me as a consultant. And that was in '65, and I wrote a paper called Alchemy and Artificial Intelligence to say that the way they were trying to achieve intelligence with computers couldn't be done. And it was sort of interesting how I knew it couldn't be done and they didn't know it couldn't be done, is that philosophers had developed a lot of very sophisticated ways of thinking about the mind, namely that there must be elementary bits of knowledge, that concepts were rules, that we had representations in our minds of the world, and we made inferences from those representations of the world, and that's how we came to behave intelligently and understand things. Now, there wasn't any particular place in that for consciousness, but they didn't care. They were trying to make computers at that point that just could behave intelligently. And what was interesting was, whereas they came to my class and said, you know, you philosophers have wasted your time for 2,000 years, once I saw what they were writing, I discovered they had inherited the whole philosophical story. The philosophers, like Descartes, believed in atomic ideas, and Hume and so forth. Kant said that concepts were rules. Husserl said that concepts were formal rules and hierarchies of rules, all sounding very AI-like. Every one of these people since Descartes believed that we had internal mental representations of the world, and they bought all that and they turned it into a research program. At the very same time that Wittgenstein published The Logical Investigations, where he was destroying that whole view, and Heidegger had already destroyed the whole Cartesian thing in 1927 in Being and Time, and since I was teaching those guys, I knew that the AI people had inherited a lemon. They had taken over in their research program a 2,000-year failure. And so I just said, okay, you guys are just behind the times. You're going to discover that this doesn't work. And they finally did, and that's what I talked about in my book, What Computers Can't Do. There were two problems: the common sense knowledge problem. Where is all this knowledge of the world stored? And I said, well, if Heidegger's right, it's not stored in the mind, it's stored out there in the world. And the proof is that you've got something called the frame problem, you guys, that you are sort of repressing, which is if something changes, like, say, I get up and walk over there, how much in my representation of the situation in the computer has to change? Well, my shadow has to go with me, and my feet go with me, but most of the stuff over there doesn't go at all, doesn't change. But they couldn't deal with that. And the only way to deal with it would have been to see what Heidegger saw, that the best model of the world is the world itself.
You have to be in the world.
Yeah, you have to be in the world, and your knowledge shows up in the familiarity of things, and when you learn something new about the world, things look different, and you learn what looks like it changes when something else changes by looking. What happened was the AI people doing what's called symbolic information processing, which is the philosophical approach to the mind, failed. And I gave them a lecture on why you have to understand Heidegger if you're going to do AI. And all this converged into something which is now called Heideggerian AI. And that's fine, except there's a new problem. We don't learn new facts about the world. We learn the world keeps changing the way it looks for us. So now, what's going to help them to get the missing thing, which is learning, or even more missing thing, which is consciousness? All this has been done on the behaviorist level. We'll just get it to behave like people, and it fails to behave like people, and darn well must fail to be conscious. Everybody agrees to that. So what would it take? The latest idea, which sounds to me like sheer madness and desperation, is to say, well, computer chips get more and more and more powerful, and once they get powerful enough so that there are as many bits on them as there are stored in the brain, then we'll be able to do this. For one thing, that's been an old story. As AI was failing and going down and down, the computer chips were getting cheaper and faster and more condensed, and they kept saying, well, we're having trouble now, but the next generation of computer chips is going to save us. And it never saved them. They just kept getting worse, and the computer chips kept getting better. It can't be that just by having all that bits in there, it's doing us any good at all, because we're crunching along.
But if it's not that, then what is it?
Nobody has any idea, and they should just keep quiet until they do. Because, I mean, I think it is the hardest question, how in the world matter, which is this third-person material stuff, could ever produce consciousness, and AI and the use of computers is not helping us understand it one bit.
Between his MA and PhD degrees in philosophy at Harvard, Bert took a series of research fellowships in Europe, during which he met leading continental philosophers, especially Heidegger, Sartre, and Merleau-Ponty. Although he was less impressed with their conversations than with their writings, he became convinced that the then unconventional ideas of phenomenology and existentialism were worth paying attention to. As religion did not play a central role in Bert's philosophy, he approached God with his characteristic iconoclasm.
What I'd like to do is explore the history of philosophy and see what we can learn about how should we think about this question about whether or not God exists.
Okay, well, that's a good question, and I'm going to give you a kind of maverick answer.
That's why I came to you.
So from Plato and Aristotle on, there have been some views about the supreme being, the good in Plato, which was eternal, and the prime mover in Aristotle, and then in the Middle Ages, there was always trying to figure out the properties of the supreme being, and one of the most important properties, namely existence, and whether being the supreme being, he didn't have to have existence, this famous ontological argument. All of that was getting nowhere, over 1,000 years of nowhere, when my hero comes on the scene, Pascal. Pascal is a very religious person and a brilliant mathematician and a super good philosopher. And he says the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob is not the God of the philosophers. So all this debate about the supreme being that Plato and Aristotle and the medieval supposed Christians is just irrelevant to us Judeo-Christians. But that's only half of it. He still does think you ought to be able to say something about God. He decided that there was something special about God in the tradition of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Their God was a present God, a God that the mind could contemplate. And Pascal said, our God is a hidden God. He's never present. You can't see him. The Jewish thing, you can't make pictures of him. And that's important. If you don't understand that, you don't understand this whole tradition that's been off the rails, because the point is you can prove the existence of God and you can prove the non-existence of God. That's what they've been doing. But they haven't realized that shows that God's not available for that kind of understanding. That the very important feature of God was that God was not present, couldn't be represented at all. And that gets you to Kierkegaard, who, leaning on Pascal, makes a big deal about the difference between what he calls metaphysical religions. Religions who think that you can have a vision of God, for instance, the way Dante does at the end of the Divine Comedy. And that's a kind of religion, but it's got nothing to do with Judeo-Christian religion. None of the Jews ever got this kind of vision of God. The best they got was a burning bush and so forth. And it turns out it's very important. They could see Jesus, the Christians, and in some sense Jesus was God. But Kierkegaard says once Jesus is here, there is no access to God the Father. We don't know anything about, we don't need to know anything about, we couldn't know anything about anything behind Jesus, which was a supreme being.
Even though Jesus says, if you've seen me, you've seen
the
God
Father. Good, that's Kierkegaard's line.
Yeah.
Because since he says that, there's nothing more to see.
Yeah.
You know all you'll ever get to know about
That's
it,
it.
so stop debating it. And you got enough. Well, Jesus, what more do you want? You got Jesus. So they're really just two totally different religions, Kierkegaard says. Metaphysical religion, which somehow mistakenly thinks it's Judeo-Christian, and the Judeo-Christian God and that religion. The next really important step is Nietzsche, who wants to say, certainly the God of the philosophers isn't anything we can know anything about or need to know anything about, but that God in general no longer plays any important role in our culture, and he expresses that by saying God is dead and we have killed him. We have killed him by presumably partly sort of misunderstanding him and doing philosophy about him, and partly by becoming, he says, so good at understanding people's desires that and being honest about our desires that we discover how much we need God, but that we haven't any evidence, and therefore we have no right to believe in him anymore. And that's the end of what Nietzsche calls monotonotheism, and which he thought was a bad idea from the start. And he says he likes polytheism.
During Dreyfus's long tenure at Berkeley, he was an influential and much beloved teacher. Bert believed that teaching is learning. He refused to teach any text that he already understood. Bert's teaching style was unique because he taught the phenomena of human existence. Bert believed that any human being could contribute. Bert's courses were genuine conversations. They were electrifying. Although Dreyfus retired from Berkeley in 1994, he continued to teach until the last day of class in December 2016, less than 5 months before he died at 87.
Bert, if we had to come up with the ultimate question, it's that fundamental concept. Why is there anything at all? Why is there something rather than nothing?
Heidegger thought that was the fundamental question too, but he thought that that way of putting the question was wrong. Heidegger got a whole book about the principle of sufficient reason, which is about why there must be a reason for it, why there must be a reason why there's something rather than nothing. And he says it's part of metaphysics, it's a wrong-headed question. You can't ask that question expecting a kind of rational answer to it. I think what Heidegger's thinking is that we're always already in it, the meaning, the universe, the world, things that are. And it's only from within it that we can deal with it and so forth. And that's the leap. Instead of getting an answer, you sort of switch the position. And instead of looking like a philosopher and a metaphysician, standing outside and looking at being and saying, well, why is there being rather than nothing? You see that you could never be in that position.
Because you're in it.
Because you're in it. And then you can have a kind of mystical awe in there being something rather than nothing, a feeling somehow about it that Heidegger seems to have, but you can't ask this kind of traditional philosophical question.
Because I feel that emotion about that question.
And Heidegger went and sat at the place where Cézanne sat when he painted Mont Saint-Victoire and said Cézanne could experience being shining through. And so being is there and it's shining in Heidegger, and but it's just wrong to ask why is being there shining. We just have to accept it and be grateful for it. And
you can appreciate it, but you can't analyze it.
Yes, exactly. You put it perfectly. After all, philosophers have tried to understand the meaning of life. That is, why are we here, and what is the highest form of life that we could have? People like Kierkegaard and Sartre and Merleau-Ponty and Heidegger, the people I read, or Pascal, are all concerned with that. And roughly, they've got some version of the view that having some commitment to some cause or to some person is the highest thing you can have, and that will give your life meaning. And that's what existential phenomenology is about.
Hubert Dreyfus came among us not to pronounce his own philosophical schemes, but to widen our philosophical stance. He gave new status to phenomenology, privileging experience, praising the holism of human sentience as intimate interactions in the world. He addressed all the perennial problems: consciousness, artificial intelligence, God, creation, religion, body and soul, existence, meaning of life. I cannot assess whether Bert's critique of AI will stand the ultimate test of vastly advanced hardware and software, but I commend his skepticism of AI's extravagant claims as a caution all should welcome. Although reports of his death were indeed not exaggerated, neither were the tributes to his life. Now, because of his tweet, when I think of his death, I smile. How clever, Bert. Hubert Dreyfus exemplified what he taught, helping us come closer to truth.
For complete interviews and for further information, please visit closertotruth.com.